You're listening to On Reflection, the beauty podcast with a global view on beauty, hosted by me, Funmi Fetto. Today's show is brought to you by our brand partner, Paula's Choice, the scientifically proven, non-irritating, multifaceted, gimmick-free skincare brand. Later in the show, I'll be joined by Carolina Benales and Jasmine Cosman from IQ. This is a tech company pushing for better diversity amongst the world's biggest beauty brands, and they'll be here to discuss their latest report, which shows that the beauty industry has a less than stellar record of representation, even after the Black Lives Matter movement. But first, required reading, where we discuss beauty stories and features that have piqued our interest. Joining me today is Ava Welsing-Kitcher. She's a beauty journalist who was formerly at the Sunday Times, stylist, InStyle, and Marie Claire. Ava, welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
I would love to start with one of the stories you've chosen by Jessica DeFino. And this featured in Coverture, and it is called The Year the Beauty Industry Radicalized Me. So anyone who knows Jessica's writing, and she's a brilliant writer who's been on this show, will not be surprised by this piece. It essentially talks about how the beauty industry is complicit in upholding patriarchal, capitalist, and white supremacist values. We all knew this, but I guess we hoped, well, I was actually quite cynical about it, but from her piece, she hoped that the pandemic would help us kind of rethink about things, certainly in the way we engage with beauty, and that we would somewhat take our foot off the pedal. But in many ways, that just didn't happen. And she says in the piece, and I quote, "In a frantic flurry of articles and Instagram posts, the pressure to perform beauty just kept coming. DIY Brazilians, extending the life of your lip filler, why applying makeup every morning can boost your confidence," and so on and so forth. And essentially what she was saying is that all of this pressure to perform, as she puts it, was nothing to do with making women feel better or making women feel more confident. It was all about stimulating the economy. And just like the government, the beauty industry has put wealth ahead of well-being. I did read this and I thought, gosh, this is quite a scathing assessment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm conflicted coming from two different standpoints as an avid beauty consumer and a beauty journalist. Like you said, Jessica often can be relied on when we're up to our necks in products and being recommended things and recommending things. And she kind of takes such an anti-product, anti-capitalist, buy view to things that I think we need that balance when it comes to beauty. And I'm really grateful to her for providing that balance. But I felt conflicted, and I think a better word is complicit. I felt like a huge spotlight had been shone because, you know, we went from saying, okay, well, here's how to trim your bangs at home, and here's how to conduct a bikini wax, and trying to keep up all these impossible beauty standards. But we also know that people rely on them for a sense of routine and comfort and normality. Then the way that pivoted to a sort of, I guess we can call it it's kind of like eat out to help out scheme. It's like buy beauty to help the economy. And I think going through the motions of that, it just really showed to me how we can be doing things to try and help people and try and report on things from a very neutral standpoint, but the ways in which we still can be complicit. I don't know if I'm maybe being oversensitive towards it, but and everything she touched upon from, you know, the way that brands upped their performativity when it came to showcasing diversity with Black Lives Matter movement resurgence and, you know, the big sustainability issue of beauty in 2020. I just think it is quite a piece and everyone listening has to go and read it. You simply must.
It's interesting you mentioned the sustainability issue. She makes a really good point that beauty and businesses can't carry on business as usual and something has to give. And I completely agree with her. She mentioned that many personal care and beauty companies actually top the 2020 plastic polluters list, even with their sustainability goals in place. That was a really interesting point she made. The piece also cites certain brands as doing good work, whether it's ethically, whether it's environmentally, whether it's politically, whether it's financially in terms of, you know, who they give to and so on. But that whole thing of being complicit will always remain. I think it's very difficult to overhaul the beauty industry entirely and still keep it an industry, as it were. Because even these companies who are so-called doing good, and I put that in inverted commas, whether they're giving money or whether they are championing certain causes or whether they are activism brands, so long as they're not charities, they are always businesses, and businesses are in the business to make money. And they thrive off a booming economy. They thrive off people buying their beauty products. And that essentially is capitalism. So, we talk about capitalism and the economy like they're these evil beasts where everyone behind them are all these evil, horrific people. But actually, a lot of people within that system, most people within that system are probably just normal, everyday people that people would view as good people and people who are just trying to make a living and who work within the system in order to put food on their table. So if no one bought beauty products for a year, for instance, the repercussions would be shocking. So in many ways, it's a weird kind of catch-22 situation. Yes, you are complicit as a beauty journalist, absolutely, without a doubt, because we write about beauty. We, whether knowingly or inadvertently, we encourage people to buy beauty products. So yeah, we are complicit, but I'm not quite sure how one can change that. I think if you recognize that you're complicit, that's great. And you do what you can within that space to make it less hideous than it actually is. But I'm not sure whether one can completely overhaul it while still being in it.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you just said. I think that a lot of the time it's quite seductive to think of capitalism as a huge machine rather than the individual cogs that make it up. We are all part of, and we don't need to do away with it completely because it is how our world functions. But what we can do from the inside out is just make the space, the boundaries of our influence as humanitarian as possible and as realistic as possible too.
I do wonder about how realistic are we being about, completely overhauling the beauty industry? I don't know. I don't really have an answer for it. I think you can only do what you can do. You can make a choice as to how you spend your money and where you spend your money. And I think also having an awareness, perhaps working within the beauty industry and having these conversations for me has made me less sort of connected to a lot of advertising. I'm not so swept up by a lot of advertising or imagery that I see in social media or things that people write about. I've probably become much more cynical and much more aware. And I think that if you feel that you're in control of that, I think that helps to inform your shopping habits. So I think a healthy dose of cynicism is probably a good thing for the beauty industry.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Right, let's go to the next story. This is actually a Mintel report that predicts that the vitamin and supplements market is due to go over £500 million by the end of 2021. And vitamin D, which is associated with immunity and memory improvement in particular, has risen significantly in the last 8 months, which obviously ties in with the pandemic. And what a lot of people are saying is that people are tapping into vitamin D because they want to strengthen their immune system against COVID. And seeing as brown and black people have been hit hard by COVID, and you tie that in with the fact that vitamin D deficiency is rife in black adults, I think this could be quite an interesting one for the community. Talk to me about why you chose this story.
I think when I first saw this, I thought, okay, what's £500 million compared to any other of these huge industries? But the skincare industry in Britain is worth just over £1 billion. So that really puts this into perspective. I never even considered vitamin D. I learned about it in science at school. It's made by our skins when we have sun exposure, we need it. And it wasn't until maybe a couple years ago when I read an article somewhere about how the black community and the brown community, especially if you are diaspora living in a country that is colder than your native climate, how you have to have vitamin D. It was a bit of a fear-mongering piece, but my radar went off as, another thing I have to buy, another supplement that could change my life. And I think there's a lot of cynicism when it comes to supplements, and this was the year that changed all of that. I mean, we're not saying that vitamin C and vitamin D is going to completely shield you from COVID, but our immune systems are a bit of a wreck because of multiple reasons. And I think vitamin D has shown me in the past just over a year that I've been using it, it just has so many more benefits than we actually know. And however cynical you might feel about supplements and vitamins that come in a pill form or a spritz under the tongue, vitamin D really has such an undisputable benefit in so many ways. I mean, now the NHS are offering a free supply to those who are most at risk of catching COVID, and they're going to start delivering it as of now. So it's backed. Before, immunity was even such a fraught topic as it has been recently for all of us, I took vitamin D as a mood booster because I suffer from seasonal affective depressive disorder. I hate the shorter days. I hate living in a country where there isn't proper sun, although we've had quite a sunny winter this year. But I took it to try and combat my lethargy, my down mood, my lack of motivation to do anything. And I really noticed a huge improvement. And it was interesting because I first started using vitamin D because it was a Black-owned supplement company called Superfood LX, and they posed vitamin D as a mood architect. It was the name of their supplement, and it was positioned for people of colour to use it to help bolster their mood during the colder seasons, but also just help support and strengthen our immune system. It was the first time I saw something supplement-wise that was specifically targeted to Black and brown people. I hope there's going to be a lot more investigations and studies on this, because I really think it's something that, just as how it took a while for, Black people to realize that we should be using sunscreen, that we do burn, we are at risk of skin damage. I think this is kind of like the sunscreen 2.0 for us.
Just going back to the link with vitamin D supplements and COVID-19, it is important to note, however, that the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence has actually concluded that there is no evidence to support taking vitamin D supplements prevents or treats COVID-19. So I just thought I'd put that out there and make it clear. However, the government does advise that people do take daily vitamin D supplements, seen as we're spending much more time indoors and out of the sunlight. And you'll probably balk at this, but I don't really take any supplements. I just struggle with them. I don't like taking tablets anyway. And to be fair, and thank God, I'm very, very, very rarely ill. But I don't know, they just make me gag. I just find them so abhorrent, and they're so horrible, a lot of them, and they have this weird aftertaste. And a lot of times they're so big. So I really do struggle. I mean, I did have a moment where I used to take zinc, and I found that to be really helpful, actually. That was mainly for skin. And I found that really, really good. But then, it's all about getting into the habit of something. So I remember taking it with me when I went away for like a few days. And then I left it there and I thought, oh, I'll get another one. And I just never did. I just never got back into the habit. I do think that a lot of supplements are really down to the quality of the supplements. I do think that they vary. I mean, I'm amazed now at the number of brands launching supplements. Every single day I receive something in my inbox about a new supplement launching. It's pretty overwhelming. And some, I do think, are taking advantage of people's fear around the pandemic and their own, I guess, mortality. And I'm not entirely sure that a lot of them actually do very much. I'm totally convinced that a huge number of them are placebos. And then also you get those gummy supplements as well. And a lot of them are just filled with sugar or a kind of sugar alternative, which I find are even worse than sugar. I'm not the poster girl for supplements, and I will never try to convince people that I was. But I do think that if you are going to take supplements, just to do your research rather than it being instigated by fear.
Absolutely. I find it refreshing when someone doesn't really take supplements. And I think given the chance, I would happily spend several months deep in an undercover investigation to find out how much of the percentage of supplements that we're being sold actually do anything at all. But I think that there definitely is a degree of fear. I think when we see stats like this, or we go to Holland and Barrett and see that all the vitamin C is sold out, we think, oh, I've never taken vitamin C in my life, but maybe I should because everyone else is doing it. And I think it ties back into the previous article we were talking about. It's like how much of these new product launches and advice that we're given is under the blanket of feeding an economy. And I think we're going to see a lot of brands that do not have adequate lab testing or studies. They just have a few impressive keywords that they will use to get people to buy stuff. And I think we're going to have a lot of folly brands emerging, but I'm hoping that all this money that's being spent is going to be poured into proper lab research, and we'll have a few really superior, amazing products and brands coming out that will hopefully reshape the reputation that supplements have been given, and rightly so.
I absolutely agree. And I think that the onus now is on everyone to do a lot of research and not just necessarily follow the crowd. Take supplements, yes, but ensure that you're taking the right ones and you're taking it for the right reasons. Because essentially, yeah, it is an industry like anything else, and people will make money out of it, and people want to make money out of it. Our entire industry, the beauty industry, the industry that serves wellness, it's all built on this whole idea of people feeling insecure about something. And these companies capitalize on that. So I do think that it's just important to be aware of that and just take it for the right reasons. And certainly for me, if anyone can create supplements that taste nice, that are tiny, that are easy to swallow, I'm all there. I'm all yours. Right. Okay, let's go to our third story. And this actually leads on nicely from the vitamin D story. It's by Lauren Clark, and it was on the My Imperfect Life website. And it's called Why the Pandemic is Causing Hair Loss in Young Women. So this story is all about stress-related hair loss. And there is a connection here with vitamin D. And we talked about this earlier. Apparently, 25 to 30-year-olds, that particular age group is currently the fastest growing in this hair loss sector. And I was quite astounded by this. I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I get so many people asking me about hair loss. I don't know how that's happened. I think it's because I've maybe posted a couple of stories about it before, but in the past week alone, I've seen about 4 or 5 or even 6 discussions and complaints online about premature hair loss in women in that age bracket. Baldness in men, we know that that happens at a much earlier onset age, but what all these professionals and ourselves, what we're seeing now is it's happening to women at a much earlier rate. And seeing this article just kind of validated everything that people have been stressed about talking to me and things that I've been stressed about. I mean, I personally go through a bout of hair loss every time the seasons change. There have been studies to show that the reduction in vitamin D can result in a hormonal fluctuation in women, which means that our hair falls out. I saw a scientist talking recently on social media about how they're starting to pay attention to vitamin D as having more of an impact on keeping your hair in your head than biotin, which we know is like the golden child of hair supplements. I think because we're at home as well, we're noticing things like how much hair is coming out in our brushes a lot more. We have time to focus on things like this, and that combined with the fact that we are actually losing more hair just, I think, leads to a bit of a panic and a frenzy. It seems like a vicious cycle. Stressing about hair loss causes stress, which makes your hair fall out, and it's just endless and endless. And I think while articles like this are so useful in validating stresses and fears that there's something seriously wrong with you, that your hair's falling out, they can also maybe generate a bit of fear that can in return make the process a bit worse. But nevertheless, there's a lot of information here which is really helpful, namely the process of how stress affects your hair loss. Your hair's in different stages, and it's either in the growing phase or it's in the resting phase. So it grows and then it rests and stays at the same length for a certain amount of time, and then it falls out naturally. So stress pushes it into the resting phase, so it stops growing, and then it leads to quicker hair fall. When we're stressed, our bodies don't prioritize things like making our hair shiny and strong or making our skin bouncy and supple. You see the same thing when people have eating disorders or they're malnourished, their hair often stops growing or falls out. I mean, there's a lot of information to unpack here, and it's an issue we don't talk about, hair loss in women. And I think that this is a really good conversation starter.
I thought it was a really interesting piece. That link to vitamin D was something that I hadn't really thought about. Your hair follicles have vitamin D receptors, which stimulates hair growth. So if your level is low or it's deficient, then you're more at risk of hair shedding. And there is, like you say, there is hair shedding that is quite normal. 100 strands a day, whatever that looks like. But I guess you'll know when something looks a little bit off, or you're noticing that your hair is thinning somewhat. The great thing about this piece is that it goes into all of that detail, and there's lots there, and I'd advise anyone to read it. I think it's a really interesting piece. But it also tells you that it is salvageable. Stress-related hair loss isn't something that you kind of just have to live with. There's lots of advice in there about seeing a specialist and things you can do yourself, like scalp massages, things you can do to lower stress levels, avoiding sulfates in your shampoos, etc. Someone in the piece also advised to limit hair washes to 3 times a week. And I have to say, I did laugh out loud because I thought, okay, you're not talking to a Black person here, because I don't know any Black person who washes their hair 3 times a week. Nevertheless, there's a lot of good advice here, and it was really insightful to how much this pandemic has impacted people on so many different levels. We talk about how wearing masks has made people break out or their skin has reacted in a certain way, but we haven't really talked about how the stress levels have also impacted what's going on with your hair and what's going on with your scalp.
Completely. And I think that's just made me think of the ways in which this pandemic has really affected a lot of women in different ways that no one's talking about.
I want us to end required reading with a lovely story, our final story about Queen Pat. Well, I should say Dame Pat. That's Pat McGrath is becoming a dame. And I'm so thrilled for her. It's for her services to fashion and beauty and diversity. And I think rightly so, actually, because she's impacted each of those areas quite significantly. When you watch a catwalk show where Pat's behind the makeup, you can just tell it's always next level. It's always pushing boundaries. It's always saying something. Her makeup looks at the shows just as significant as the fashion in terms of telling the story. And you can't really say that about every single makeup artist. I mean, she's sublime.
She is truly amazing. And I think this was such a huge spark of joy when I saw this news. I think you hit the nail on the head completely. Even when you're backstage at Fashion Week and there's just an air and an aura to the atmosphere when Pat is deciding how everyone's going to look, and just seeing her work her magic it's such a momentous occasion. And then when you think about Pat as the makeup artist and then Pat as the brand, the amazing stats and numbers of how she completely changed the Selfridges Beauty Hall. And it's just a true legacy of Dame Mother. I'm sure no one's going to be calling her that, but she'll always be mother to the industry's greatest, won't she?
I love that, Dame Mother. That's hysterical, Ava. But no, you're right about her business. Her makeup line is incredibly successful. It's incredibly well made. And I loved the collaboration with Supreme last year. I mean, that was just everything. I've kept mine in a box, actually. I think at some point I'll probably frame it and hang it on the wall. Incredible how it just sold out so quickly. I think a lot of people bought it not to actually use, but just to keep it as a collector's piece. One of the things that I love about her actually is that she's such a leading light to a lot of the younger generation of makeup artists. She's still on her A game. She's still really fresh. She's still coming up with incredible ideas. And she also has this wonderful love and affection for the makeup community. I loved how she responded via Instagram because, of course, how else do you communicate these days? And she said, I dedicate this honor in tribute to makeup artists everywhere. I adore each and every one of you. Never give up on your dreams. With hard work, creativity, and perseverance, anything is possible. And I think actually those are quite good words to live by.
Absolutely. And we can apply them to anyone doing anything creatively or even not in creative industries. She's such a beacon of ingenuity and hope. And I think even just laying eyes on her and her work and everything she's achieved, it's like a cup of motivational coffee, and it really instills something great in everyone. She's truly an icon.
Absolutely. Ava, thank you so much for coming on Required Reading.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's now time for In Praise Of. This is a section of the show where we laud the merits of a single beauty product. This week, it's Paula's Choice Clinical Retinol and Bakuchiol Treatment. Anyone who knows anything about skin will tell you that retinol should be in every grown-up skincare regime. It is a superhero ingredient that does amazing things to your face. It smooths out lines, it retexturizes skin, it brightens, it helps with hyperpigmentation, the whole shebang. So I get it. But my goodness, some of the formulas, they are brutal. They sit firmly in the no pain, no gain category. Lots of dryness, peeling, shedding. Yes, a lot of this comes down to how well your skin tolerates retinol and how exactly you are using it. A good percentage of people misuse retinol. That's a whole other story for another day. Still, it's a lot to deal with, and I personally don't have the energy for it, which is where Bakuchiol comes in. I remember a few years back when I initially came across the word, I thought it was a new superfood being lauded by the wellness movement, but no. It's actually a brilliant antioxidant that does similar things to retinol, but it's just much gentler. Which is great, but there's a demanding lot, bit like me, who still want the power of a good retinol without shedding like a snake and would also like some extras with that, thank you very much. Paula's Choice heard our cry. This treatment has combined the two ingredients along with collagen-boosting peptides, and the result is epic. It does all the good things you'd expect from a decent retinol. It reduces the visibility of fine lines, evens out skin tone, restores firmness, etc. But this is next level. By adding Bakuchiol, the retinol becomes even more effective. It makes it work harder, it makes it work longer. And because Bakuchiol is also soothing, you get all the benefits of retinol without irritation and without sensitivity. Essentially, it's everything you could ever want in a retinol, but never knew was possible. Well, now it is. Now, talking points. So a few months ago on Required Reading, I talked about a story which appeared in Fast Company. And the story was called Beauty Brands Were Quick to Tout Diversity During Summer Protests, but the commitment was short-lived. The piece talked about a report by a company called IQ. It was a report that found that post the death of George Floyd and the global protests that followed, beauty brands posting darker skin tones on their social media channel was up by 122%. This was between May and July. By October, that had gone down to minus 9%. I'm joined by the woman behind IQ, Carolina Benales and Jasmine Cosman, to talk about the report, which is called The State of Visual Diversity and Inclusion in the Beauty Industry. Carolina and Jasmine, all the way from Uruguay, I must say, by a beach, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. So for those who don't actually know, IQ is a social media analytics platform that essentially sells its analytics to beauty brands who want to better understand the images that are engaging users and therefore helping to drive sales. I'd love you to talk to me a little bit about why diversity has become such a key part of the company.
Great. So IQ is my second startup. My first startup was Glam Street, that is a virtual makeover app where you can try makeup virtually in your face. So you took a picture of yourself and then you start applying, for example, 20 different shades of lipstick in less than 1 minute. Creating that technology was a big challenge. Why? Because we didn't know who was trying the technology, who was behind the camera. So we need to set up the technology to work with the widest audience as possible. For the last 8 years, I have been working on creating technology that works for many different age range, skin tones, ethnicities, and different genders. So it was super important, and it was in our core of our values to be diverse with our technology, to accept diversity, and for women to try different makeups as realistic as possible, no matter who was the skin tone or the age range that they have. Being in that industry, in the tech industry and in the beauty industry for 8 years with Glam Street showed me that also for brands and for the customers, there was a gap on diversity, on the media that they use, on the photos that they were creating for media. So when I started IQ, we were going to target the beauty industry because we understand that industry, we have been working with them, and we also understand their challenges. And one of the top challenge was diversity. So we start creating these algorithms without knowing that we are going to create this report. But when all the movement happens in the US, we saw a really clear opportunity to show up with data what was going on the beauty industry.
So the issue around diversity, or should I say the lack of diversity within the beauty industry, that's really, it's nothing new, but seeing it in black and white, I mean, goodness me, that's quite something. There is so much in the report that highlights the historic lack of diversity in the industry, and also a lack of diversity around the influencers that brands use to generate content. This was the real shocking one, actually, how performative the response to Black Lives Matter was and still is. I think people maybe thought that there was a lot of performative behavior that was going on during that time, but I think it still feels quite shocking when you see it in hard data. I'd love you to talk me through the key findings in the report and basically what it says about the industry.
Absolutely. Now that we have a full year of data, so at the time the article came out, we were in October, and we were hoping that potentially the last couple of months had been a bit of an anomaly. But now that we have studied the whole year, we kind of have the full insights on what the reaction has been. So going back to what Carolina was saying about this report and how we gathered that information. So we studied over 80 beauty brands and the content they posted all year long. And when there was a skin tone in the picture, whether it was a portrait or a close-up, we would categorize that skin tone according to the Fitzpatrick scale, which is an objective scale that is used a lot in beauty development to analyze and identify different skin tone colors. And so our algorithm, that is machine learning, identified that, and then they summarize it. And the findings were really shocking, even for us working in analytics and working in the industry. So we saw that up until the end of May, when the murder of George Floyd occurred, on average, brands had around 14-15% of their contents of darker skin-toned images. It meant that actually over 50% of the images were the lightest skin tone, the lighter skin tone. So there were as many light skin tone images as there were dark and medium skin tone images combined up to this point in time in 2020. And that had remained relatively constant for 2019 and 2018. So it's not that it had been continuously improving and this accelerated thing. It really had stagnated over the last couple of years. We then reached June, and the consumers demanded really a reaction from the brands. And I think a lot of brands were also compelled to show their vocal support for anti-racism at the time. And we see a huge spike in the diversity of the posts that included skin tones posted by the brands. And here we see that darker skin tones go from being represented in around 13, 14, 15% of the images beforehand to around 23%. Now, you may think that 23% is not enough or not as much, but when you then combine it also with the medium skin tone images, we actually saw a reversal where now the lighter skin tones only represented 30%, so a third of all skin images with skin tone, versus 70% being medium or darker skin tone. So that's great because it really shows a much more balanced representation of skin types in beauty brands' feeds. Fast forward to July, progress still continues. The numbers still look much more diverse than they were before, albeit starting to decline back to less darker skin tone image and less medium skin tone images, and lighter skin tone images start growing again. And this trend unfortunately continues up until October, where all the increase in diversity was all but reversed, and we again have only around 13% of images being of the darker skin tones. So at that point, actually something happens. And in November and December, we see a change that is very much brought about by holiday season campaigns, where again, there is an increase in diversity and there's an improvement in the share of dark skin post and medium skin post. And again, the lighter skin post reduced at the time. So during the holiday season, what a lot of beauty brands do is a much more planned and strategic campaign. So the plan for whether it's Thanksgiving in the US or Christmas time in the UK, and they have certain end of New Year campaigns. And because we can see when they plan it, diversity is in their radar, and they do want to have a wider representation of skin tones. And then we see that improvement. But in other months, around September, October, perhaps they didn't have any big launches or campaign planned. It really goes back of mind again, and you see the diversity slipping back to how it was before June, July this year.
Thank you, Jasmine. I find it interesting that the diversity is only highlighted at certain periods of the year. Is that equated with sales? Is that because they know that in that period, if they make their campaigns or the social images much more diverse, then they've seen some sort of correlation with sales?
Here, for me, unfortunately, we can only speculate, because sales information is information that the brands hold. So it's very hard for us. It's not information that's publicly available. So our speculation is more that it's image, lip service, if we're being cynical, but also promoting the purpose and the vision for the brands during key moments of the year, if we are being optimistic.
And what did you discover around the lack of diversity when it comes to brands utilizing influencers to generate content?
Here it's really interesting. So for every one darker skin toned influencer that beauty brands work with, they would work with 4 light skin tone ones. This is obviously the average across the industry, so there may be exceptional brands among them. So there isn't only a disparity in terms of the number of darker and medium skin tone influencers brands engage, but there's also a disparity in the number of posts generated by these users and influencers that they would then repost on their feeds. So if I give you an example, on average, a darker skin tone influencer gets 2 of their posts used by brands, whereas a white or lighter skinned influencer gets 3 of their posts used by a brand. So there is really this vicious cycle whereby not only are there less images overall of darker skin tone influencers or user generated content, so that the darker skin tone influencers and users have to fight for fewer spots, so to say. But then also, once the brands choose to use a darker skin tone or medium skin tone influencer, they then don't use them as many times as they would use the lighter skin tone influencers.
Tell me, how have the industry actually responded to this? Because, of course, this does not look good for them at all.
The response has been great, especially when the articles came out, and it has been really humbling. So beauty brands have come from all over the world with a really humble attitude, saying, hey, we want to do this better, we want to improve, we want to know where we stand. And a lot of it, I have to say, is honestly, it's very hard for brands looking back to understand how they've been representing diversity or how they haven't. Because one thing is, anecdotally, we all know it. You pick up a magazine, you look on Instagram, and kind of get the sense. And as a consumer, we're all very aware of that. But when you're running a business, you have to have the data to back things up. And if you want to track progress, you also need that data. So brands are very open at the moment to saying, hey, tell us where we are, and then setting objectives on how they're going to improve this. So the reaction of the brands have been, one, great to have the data, a bit obviously of shame when they weren't performing as well as they should. But in general, it has been shock and surprise, and then a proactive, what can we do about this? How can we improve the situation?
I always find that really interesting when I hear those kind of stories, because I hear them a lot. And perhaps I'm just being really simplistic about it. For me, I've always said that the answer to this isn't as complicated as a lot of brands make it. I really don't think it's that complicated. And sometimes it feels like we're going round in circles. I don't necessarily believe that brands need to have data in order to realize that they're not being particularly inclusive. You talk about all of these issues, but you also are very well aware that these diversity issues can't be eradicated by simply changing the posts on social media. There needs to be this real commitment to inclusivity, and it has to be a continued commitment. Tell me, what are the things that you are recommending that brands do?
So many things, from simple things to much more complex things that will take a long time. So we wanted to give some really actionable advice that any brand and consumers can really take on board from today. The first is going back to this data and tracking, and really understanding how the content, the visual content that you put out there, is affecting your diversity perception amongst consumers and your diversity overall. And these things nowadays, as you say, it's not enough just to say, okay, we've got all these huge purposes of being an inclusive brand. If then what you're doing, what you're showing with your feed, which is ultimately what a lot of consumers see of you as a brand, does not reflect that. So the fact that now we have tools like IQ means that brands can be held accountable, and brands, not only brands, but also consumers. Because I think a lot of the times we feel, because this year a lot of brands have increased their diversity effort, and we have seen perhaps a lot more diverse people being featured in beauty brands' social media. We think that they're doing well, or that the work is done. The fact that we're getting platforms like in this podcast and in other media just really reminds consumers that it's not all done, that this should be an ongoing effort, it shouldn't be a just one month thing. So data and tracking in order to maintain accountability and promote accountability really is key. Then secondly, it's about learning. We would recommend that brand look at those brands that are being much more diverse and inclusive. And here we'd like to highlight a few brands that have the highest share of dark and medium skin tone content, and in particular brands that have been consistently good at it, so that we know they're not just paying lip service to the movement or the consumer sentiment at the moment. And here we've got brands like The Lip Bar, which is a US bar specializing in lipsticks, and Fenty Beauty, which both have founders that have darker or medium skin tones.
I think it's almost expected that you will have brands like The Lip Bar and Fenty who have founders that are Black. I think you expect that there would be a level of diversity there, because they so recognize the lack of diversity and inclusivity in the beauty industry. And that is part of the conversation that those two brands and those two founders have worked hard to change. Tell me about some other brands that are not necessarily Black founded.
We see MAC have done a fantastic job at engaging with users and influencers and micro-influencers. And that's one of the key bits of advice that we would give for brands, because by engaging with the user base and the community that already loves their products, they will inevitably become more diverse, just because people are more diverse. So utilizing that content, as long as you're open to not filtering that content from the selection point, can give you a huge database and a huge library of material that you can use and immediately become more diverse. And not only more diverse, but represent people who are engaged with your product already. So a community-based approach where you highlight the diversity of your community and expose them to your feed does two things: makes your brand more diverse, but also gives opportunities to micro-influencers, for example, of darker skin tones who tend to get lesser exposure, as we said beforehand, in terms of the number of influencers that brands tend to use.
Initially, when people read some of the articles about your report, they probably thought it was just about brands not using Black women or Black people in their posts. But really, there's an element of colorism in there as well, because some brands might be using people of color or Black people, but maybe they're steering more towards the lighter skinned people.
That's absolutely the case. And it's fair also to say the report did to focus very much on the darker side of the spectrum because of the Black Lives Matters movement. And we really wanted to address that need for data in that regard. But we are also monitoring the split, so the share, so how many posts out of each type. And what we want to advocate with the use of data is greater diversity overall, not really just growing one group. And it's not only skin tone diversity, as Carolina mentioned, it can also be ethnicity diversity. It can be age diversity, which is also a huge topic for beauty brands, which we haven't addressed in this report at all. But the same applies in terms of using the data. Going back to your community will help you be more diverse in all those regards. Third recommendation would be really around thinking about the content that you put out there. So we have highlighted the fact that there is little skin tone diversity in those posts where there is skin, so a close-up or a portrait. But diversity isn't just in what's in the skin tone of the image. It could be in the type of products that you feature. So, for example, the classic example would be foundations, where we have seen a lot more brands showing a range of foundation colors when promoting a certain product. But it could also be things like the captions. So what type of product features do you highlight in the caption? Are you highlighting the fact that it's a glowy foundation or it's matte? Because different types of skin require different types of attributes in products. Or, for example, are you showing an eyeshadow in a young person's eye or an older person's eye? Because that would look completely different. So it's not just about the skin color. It's really about the products that you're choosing to portray and what attributes of those products you're highlighting in your post that will be resonate more with certain type of audiences. And then that also will increase the diversity of your brand and diversity of your audience.
Another thing that we talked about when we talked prior to you coming onto the show was about the lack of diversity within the companies. There are so many companies who are showcasing a certain level of diversity or perhaps a lack of diversity and maybe getting it wrong. Surely a lot of that is also down to the lack of inclusivity within the actual company.
So there is important also to have diverse teams who are creating these products, not only the marketing teams and content creators, but people who is behind the formulas, behind the qualities of the product, what is the concerns of the different type of skin conditions that we have in our customer that is much more instinctive if we have diverse teams to develop the products. In my experience, creating the app, it was really hard for us in the meeting with the brands to get a diverse audience in the meetings to try the technology. So I can say that after more than 6 years selling technology to beauty brands, that diversity is an issue inside the teams.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I do hope that brands pay attention. What's the best way to get hold of you?
The webpage is iqinsight.com. And we have an email that is contact@iqinsight.com that brands can write to us and also consumers if they want some insights or media coverage.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carolina. And thank you, Jasmine, for coming on.
Thank you, Funmi.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here and to share with you the report and our findings.
And that's it for this week. Please do visit us on orbpodcast.com for links to the articles we discussed today. And if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter and to On Reflection podcast. My thanks to my guests, Ava Welsing-Kitcher, Carolina and Jasmine from IQ, that's EYECUE, this week's brand partner, Paula's Choice, and to you for listening to On Reflection.